December 1940, the cold wind swept across the small coastal town of Lyme Regis, rattling shutters and carrying with it the distant echo of artillery from the European continent. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the salty tang of the sea mingled with the pervasive anxiety of wartime England. Every family, every child, seemed to carry the invisible weight of fear of bombings, fear of invasion, and, most urgently, fear for the sailors who braved the Atlantic, only to vanish beneath the dark waves in a modest home perched on the edge of town. 12-year-old Thomas Fletcher hunched over a wooden table, illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. Around him, the room was a clutter of maps, notebooks filled with frantic scribbles, and a small, crackling radio that sputtered out news of yet another convoy attacked by German U-boats. To most, the ocean was a distant threat. To Thomas, it was a puzzle he was determined to solve. His fingers traced the lines of the Atlantic, following the paths of Allied ships that carried men, supplies, and hope across the treacherous waters. He paused at each mark where a ship had been lost, imagining the faces of sailors, the creak of their decks, the cold spray of the ocean on their faces. "There has to be a way to stop them," he muttered to himself, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "There has to be a way." Unlike other boys his age who played with marbles or kicked battered footballs along the village streets, Thomas's mind was consumed by naval strategy. He devoured books on battleships, submarine warfare, and radar technology, sketching models and calculating routes late into the night. The radio was his lifeline, broadcasting reports of sinking convoys, U-boats evading detection, and the growing desperation of the Allies. Each news bulletin was a spark that fueled his obsession, a reminder that lives depended on strategies he could barely imagine, yet refused to ignore. But Thomas's ideas were audacious, bordering on impossible. He envisioned patterns, codes, and routes that could outsmart the German submarines. He imagined decoy ships, early warning systems, and clever tactics that no official plan had yet considered. And yet he was just a boy. Every time he tried to explain his thoughts to adults, teachers, neighbors, even a retired sailor who occasionally visited the town, they laughed or shook their heads in pity. "Dreaming won't stop torpedoes, lad," they said. "Stick to school and let the Navy handle this." Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his mind, his curiosity, and his obsession with the ocean might hold the key to saving hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. His heart pounded as he imagined the convoys cutting through the North Atlantic, each ship a fragile lifeline, each sailor a story waiting to be snatched from the jaws of war. Could a boy's plan, scribbled on scraps of paper by candlelight, really change the course of the war? The candle flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls lined with maps and naval charts. Outside, the wind roared against the windows, as if echoing Thomas's unspoken fear that the ocean might claim too many before anyone noticed a child's daring idea. Yet despite the chill, despite the doubts, despite the impossible odds, Thomas leaned closer to his maps, eyes bright with determination. He whispered under his breath, almost as a promise to the countless souls at sea, "I'll find a way. I have to." And in that moment, in a quiet room at the edge of a small English town, the first spark of what would become an audacious, world-changing plan ignited. One boy, a sea of uncertainty, and the looming shadow of German U-boats. This was the beginning of a story no one could have predicted. Could this boy's impossible plan really save lives where a seasoned strategist had failed? The question hung in the air, heavy and urgent, as the waves crashed beyond the cliffs, carrying both fear and hope into the winter night. The year was 1941, and the shadow of war had settled over England like a cold, unyielding fog. In the coastal town of Lyme Regis, life had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Streets that once echoed with laughter now carried the anxious murmur of neighbors discussing the latest air raid warnings. Blackout curtains hung in every window, turning homes into dim, oppressive sanctuaries. Every evening, the wail of air raid sirens cut through the night, sending families scrambling to shelters, clutching gas masks and each other. Thomas Fletcher had grown used to the rhythm of fear. Yet every incident cut deeper than the last. He would wake to the distant boom of shells across the channel or the faint, haunting whistle of a bomb descending from the sky. At school, lessons were interrupted as teachers read aloud telegrams, official notices of ships sunk by German U-boats. Each message was a reminder that the Atlantic was a battlefield, and every ship carried men whose lives were precariously balanced between survival and oblivion. One morning, Thomas stood on the cliffs overlooking the harbor, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The sea stretched endlessly, gray and merciless, and a convoy of merchant ships bobbed like toy boats far below. Just days before, news had reached town of the SS Manchester Trader, a vessel lost to a U-boat attack. Families had waited anxiously, sending letters that would never be delivered, their hopes swallowed by the deep. Thomas could almost see the men aboard, their faces etched with courage and fear, unaware that death could strike from beneath the waves at any moment. His stomach tightened, a mix of grief and helplessness. Rationing made survival in town a quiet struggle. Bread was thin, meat scarce, and even coal for warmth was carefully measured. But the boy noticed that these hardships paled against the larger battle waging at sea. Local sailors who returned on leave spoke in hushed tones of torpedoed ships, frantic rescues, and bodies pulled from icy waters. Thomas listened intently, memorizing every detail. He could picture the chaos, the panic, the terror, and it fueled his determination. The war was vast and ruthless, and yet here he was, a boy armed only with his mind and imagination, thinking he could make a difference at the docks. Thomas often lingered to watch the ships being loaded and unloaded, the sailors' strong hands working tirelessly against the relentless tide. He overheard conversations about convoy routes, U-boat sightings, and naval escorts, absorbing it all like a sponge. One afternoon, a sailor paused to speak to him. "Boy, the sea doesn't forgive mistakes. You can study all you want, but it's a cruel teacher." Thomas nodded, pretending to understand, but inside he felt a spark ignite. He refused to believe that age and size determined who could impact the war. If the adults couldn't stop the U-boats, maybe someone with fresh eyes, someone who dared to think differently, could. The news was relentless. Telegrams arrived daily, bearing names of the lost, their stories abruptly ended by unseen torpedoes. Each sinking was a jolt to Thomas's resolve. In quiet moments, he would sit with his maps, plotting patterns, calculating possible U-boat positions, imagining ways convoys could evade destruction. He sketched decoy routes and signaled imagined messages, working tirelessly to turn the chaos into order. It was exhausting, often lonely work, but each failure and doubt only strengthened his resolve. Evenings brought air raids, and Thomas would clutch a candle and his maps in the shelter, the roar of bombs above reminding him that time was fleeting. "If I don't find a way," he whispered, voice barely audible, "then more lives will be lost." His imagination became a weapon, his curiosity a strategy, and his fear a motivator. The boy could not fight with guns or ships, but he could fight with intellect, with planning, with courage that belied his years. The town itself was a portrait of perseverance amidst terror. Mothers carried children through blacked-out streets. Shopkeepers measured rations with trembling hands, and neighbors comforted one another through whispered prayers. Yet, beneath the surface, hope lingered, fragile but persistent, as if the human spirit refused to bow to fear. Thomas clung to that hope like a lifeline, knowing that somewhere in the Atlantic, the lives of men depended on ideas yet untested, on a plan that had yet to see the light of day. By the cliffs, beneath the gray, unending sky, Thomas Fletcher made a silent vow. He would not wait for others to solve this. He would study, he would calculate, and he would dare to dream the impossible. If a boy could find a way to outsmart the U-boats, maybe, just maybe, he could save the convoys and the lives of countless sailors who were counting on courage they couldn't yet know existed. The winter of 1941 had settled like a heavy blanket over Lyme Regis, and the war showed no mercy. News of U-boat attacks continued to dominate the radio, and every sinking left the town a little grayer, a little quieter. Thomas Fletcher, however, refused to let despair claim him. With his maps meticulously redrawn and calculations refined, he had reached a point where hiding his ideas no longer felt right. The boy knew that the lives of men at sea depended on someone willing to take A risk that most adults would never even consider. And so, with a bundle of papers clutched tightly under his arm, he made his way to the nearest naval office, determination blazing in his eyes. The office was a modest building, with peeling paint and the faint smell of coal smoke lingering in the air. A young clerk glanced at Thomas with mild curiosity as he entered. "Can I help you, lad?" the clerk asked. Thomas swallowed his nerves and laid the papers on the counter. I have an idea to help protect the convoys from U-boats," he said, voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I know it sounds impossible. But please, just look." Word of a boy with a plan reached the officers quickly. Captain Reynolds, a stern man in his 50s, called Thomas into a small office lined with charts and naval logs. He leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing the boy. "You understand this is no game, son," he said. "We're talking about lives. Lives lost if your idea is flawed." Thomas met his gaze unflinchingly. "I understand, sir. But I believe I can help. I've studied routes, boat patterns, convoy behavior. I've worked out a strategy that could reduce losses." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "A 12-year-old thinks he can outthink seasoned captains and intelligence officers?" Thomas didn't falter. "I'm only suggesting patterns and early warning tactics. Nothing replaces trained men at sea, sir. But I believe this could help." The officers whispered among themselves. Some laughed quietly, dismissing him outright. "Send him home? Let him play with his maps, but this is war business," one muttered. Others, more cautious, leaned closer to examine the boy's drawings. There was something meticulous, almost uncanny, in the way Thomas had plotted convoy routes and potential U-boat positions. Charts, arrows, timing calculations all indicated an understanding far beyond his years. Next, he visited the local scientist who advised the Navy on radio detection technology. Professor Whitman, a portly man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, examined Thomas's notes with growing curiosity. "Your idea? It's unconventional," he said slowly. "But some patterns here align with known weaknesses in U-boat patrol strategies. You may be onto something, lad." Thomas's chest swelled with cautious hope. Could a single person, even a child, really influence such vast and dangerous operations? Despite Whitman's encouragement, the majority remained skeptical. Debates raged in offices and meeting rooms. "We can't risk ships on a boy's calculations," one officer exclaimed. "It's reckless, bordering on madness." Yet there was an undeniable intrigue. Thomas's ideas weren't wild fantasies. They were detailed, logical, and audacious. One by one, a few decision-makers agreed to cautiously test his strategy, creating simulations and trial runs using smaller vessels and controlled routes. For Thomas, the tension was unbearable. Each day he waited for results, heart hammering with every report. Could a child's plan survive the harsh reality of the Atlantic? Could it actually work when lives hung in the balance? He spent sleepless nights revising calculations, anticipating every possible outcome, and preparing for the moment his ideas would face the ultimate test. As the first trial convoys set sail using elements of his plan, Thomas stood at the harbor, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Each ship seemed to carry not just cargo and men, but the weight of his own dreams, the responsibility of countless families waiting at home. The sea, as unforgiving as ever, mirrored his tension waves crashing against the docks like a drumbeat of fate. One wrong decision, one miscalculation, could mean disaster. And yet, amidst the fear and skepticism, there was a spark of hope. If his plan worked, if these officers and scientists were willing to take even a measured risk on his strategy, then perhaps the tides could be turned. Perhaps a boy's mind, fueled by determination and courage, could change the course of the war. The shadow of U-boats still loomed silent and deadly beneath the waves, but Thomas Fletcher refused to look away. He had dared to dream, and now, the world was about to see whether that dream could survive reality. The chill of January 1941 clung to the streets of Lyme Regis, carrying with it the ever-present hum of wartime tension. Word of U-boat attacks along the Atlantic coast had reached even the smallest towns, and fear had become a quiet companion to every family. 12-year-old Thomas Fletcher, however, had little time for fear. His nights were consumed by maps, sketches, and endless calculations, his days spent observing the harbor and the comings and goings of the convoys. He knew that time was running out. Every ship sunk was a life lost, and every life lost was another reason to act. Determined, Thomas clutched a stack of papers as he approached the local naval office. Inside, officers were busy sorting reports of recent attacks, their faces lined with exhaustion and frustration. Thomas's arrival drew curious glances. "Can I help you, lad?" a clerk asked, looking him up and down. Thomas swallowed his nervousness. I have an idea to help protect convoys from U-boats," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please just look at my plan." Soon enough, Captain Reynolds, a man whose reputation for sternness was known across the county, was summoned to review the boy's notes. He examined Thomas carefully, eyebrows furrowed. "You're aware, boy, that this is no simple game?" Reynolds asked. "We're talking about real ships, real men, and real danger." Thomas nodded firmly. "I understand, sir. But I believe my plan could help. I've studied convoy routes, boat patterns, and I think there's a way to reduce losses." Reynolds exchanged a skeptical glance with his aides. "A child suggesting naval strategy? You do realize the scale of what you're proposing?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not saying I can replace the Navy. I just believe there are patterns they might not see, routes that could avoid attacks." The room was silent for a long moment. Some officers snorted, shaking their heads. "Send him home," one muttered. "Let him play with his maps? This is war, not child's play." Yet not everyone dismissed him outright. Several leaned over the papers, eyebrows knitting in concentration as they traced the boy's proposed convoy routes, noting the logic and precision that belied his age. Later, Thomas presented his idea to Professor Whitman, a consultant for naval detection technology. The professor squinted through his spectacles at the maps and notes, adjusting them slowly. "Remarkable, precise. Perhaps unconventional, but there is merit here," Whitman said quietly. "Some of these patterns correspond with known gaps in U-boat patrols. We might be able to test this." Carefully, Thomas's heart surged with cautious hope. Even so, resistance was fierce. Officers debated the risks heatedly. "We cannot base operational decisions on a child's calculations." One barked. Another countered, "But there is a certain ingenuity here. Perhaps a controlled trial could show results without risking full convoys." The tension in the room mirrored the stormy sea outside, a precarious balance between doubt and possibility. Finally, a small group of decision-makers agreed to a cautious trial. They would use a single convoy, employing elements of Thomas's strategy under strict supervision. The boy was both elated and terrified. The success of his plan was not guaranteed, and failure could mean disaster not just for the convoy, but for his credibility and perhaps even his small-town reputation. As he watched the convoy depart from the harbor, Thomas felt a rush of adrenaline. Each ship was more than a vessel. Each carried lives dependent on the gamble adults were willing to take on a boy's vision. The wind tugged at his coat, the waves clashed against the pier like a relentless heartbeat, and the shadow of the unseen U-boats loomed beneath the water, silent and deadly. This was the moment of truth. A single spark of hope, a child's audacity, and the cold, unforgiving sea. Could Thomas Fletcher's daring plan withstand reality? Could a boy truly outthink the darkness that stalked the Atlantic? The answer would soon reveal itself, and the fate of countless lives hung in the balance. The winter of 1941 had grown harsher, the Atlantic a churning expanse of gray beneath a slate sky. For weeks, Thomas Fletcher had watched from the cliffs as the first trial convoys set sail under the cautious implementation of his plan. Every ship, every sailor felt like a personal responsibility, and every radio report from the Navy made his stomach tighten with a mix of hope and dread. Now, the moment had come to expand the experiment. The Allied command had decided to adopt key elements of Thomas's strategy on a larger convoy, and the boy could only wait, tense and silent. As the fleet departed from the harbor, the convoy cut through the North Atlantic with careful precision. Ships moved in staggered formations, their courses subtly altered to avoid known U-boat patrol zones. Decoy vessels, smaller and slower, zigzagged along parallel routes, designed to confuse enemy submarines tracking the main convoy. Thomas had suggested early warning signals using radio bursts at irregular intervals, a tactic meant to give escort ships extra time to intercept lurking U-boats. It was audacious and terrifying in its novelty. Hours passed like days as Thomas and the few officers who had trusted him monitored the progress. Overhead, storm clouds gathered, sending sheets of rain lashing against the cliffs. The sea roared, waves rising higher than the tallest masts, threatening to swallow the convoy whole. Lightning illuminated the tumultuous horizon, briefly revealing the silhouettes of ships tossed by the merciless waves. Each flash made Thomas's heart leap. The boy's mind raced, imagining every potential danger, the hidden U-boat prowling beneath, the panic aboard the ships, the chaos of the ocean's fury. Then, the first test of the plan began. Radar operators aboard escort ships picked up faint, irregular blip signs of U-boats attempting to intercept the convoy. The decoys went into motion. Smaller vessels altered their courses, creating a confusing dance of movement across the waves. Torpedoes launched toward the decoys, striking false targets and exploding harmlessly against empty hulls. Thomas's pulse raced as he imagined the crews on the real ships. Unaware of the invisible shields his strategies provided, the storm intensified. Rain stung Thomas's cheeks, and the wind howled like a predator circling its prey. Reports crackled over the radio, describing near misses and close calls, each one a testament to the delicate balance between victory and disaster. "Another U-boat sighted east of the convoy," a voice shouted. Thomas clenched his fists, refusing to breathe until the outcome became clear. Every calculation, every map, every sleepless night now teetered on the edge of reality. Hours dragged on, each moment stretching into eternity. Thomas imagined the sailors below deck, gripping railings as their ships pitched and rolled, waves crashing over the decks. He envisioned the U-boat crews, their torpedo tubes aimed, unaware that the signals, routes, and decoys were leading them astray. The tension was unbearable, yet Thomas felt a flicker of pride amidst the fear. His ideas, born in a candle-lit room, were now alive on the unforgiving waters of the Atlantic dock as night fell. The storm subsided, leaving a wet, cold calm in its wake. Reports finally began to indicate that the convoy had passed through the danger zones largely unscathed. Some decoys had been struck, some minor damage reported, but the main fleet had survived. Thomas allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The boy's plan, his impossible, audacious plan, had worked. Lives had been saved, and for the first time, Thomas Fletcher felt the weight of success. But even in triumph, there was no time for celebration. The sea remained treacherous, and U-boats would continue to stalk the convoy lanes. Thomas knew this was only the beginning. His strategies had to evolve, adapt, and remain one step ahead of the enemy. Yet, for a fleeting moment, hope burned bright. Against storms, skepticism, and the deadly cunning of the U-boats, a boy's mind had made a difference. As he gazed at the horizon, Thomas Fletcher felt a surge of determination. The ocean still held countless dangers, but the impossible had been achieved once. And if one boy's plan could save even a single convoy, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could save many more. The waves crashed against the cliffs, echoing the heartbeat of a young strategist who dared to challenge the odds. And somewhere beneath the gray horizon, the U-boats prowled, unaware that their hunt had been foiled by the ingenuity of a boy who refused to surrender to fear. The sun rose over Lyme Regis, after a night of relentless waves and storm-tossed convoys, casting pale light across the cliffs and harbor. For the first time in months, the town seemed to breathe, as if the very air had been holding its collective fear in check. Thomas Fletcher stood at the edge of the pier, shivering in the cold morning wind, but his eyes sparkled with cautious triumph. Reports from the convoy trickled in through crackling radios. The ships had evaded the lurking U-boats. Decoys had misled torpedoes, and no lives had been lost. The relief that washed over the town was palpable. Sailors who returned on leave hugged their families with a fervor that spoke of lives saved by invisible hands. Mothers wept softly, clutching children who had been spared the grief of fathers lost at sea. And in the midst of it all, a boy 12 years old, small and wiry, eyes bright with determination, was slowly coming to terms with the magnitude of what he had achieved. News of Thomas's plan began to spread, whispered at first through naval offices and then carried by the wind to towns along the coast. Some were incredulous, a child influencing naval strategy. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Ships had survived where before destruction seemed certain. Officers who had doubted him now approached with quiet respect, their skepticism replaced with astonishment. Captain Reynolds, the man who had once questioned his very presence, now shook Thomas's hand firmly. "You've done something remarkable, lad. Lives have been saved because of your mind." Even Professor Whitman, who had first hinted at the potential of the boy's ideas, allowed a rare smile. "You've shown us that strategy and insight can come from anywhere, even a child. Your work will influence how convoys are routed for months to come." Thomas's heart swelled. The boy who had watched helplessly from the cliffs, haunted by the image of lost sailors, had now become a part of the solution, his courage and intellect shaping the very course of the war. In the days that followed, Thomas continued to refine his calculations, working closely with naval strategists who now saw the value in his observations. The boy's room, once cluttered only with maps and sketches, became a hub of innovation as officers and scientists sought his input. Each successful implementation of his ideas reinforced a growing truth: age mattered little. When the stakes were high and the mind was sharp. At the harbor, Thomas watched ships set sail along new routes, his plans now forming a protective web across the Atlantic. He imagined the sailors aboard, unaware that a boy's audacity had guided them past unseen dangers, and he felt a quiet pride mixed with humility. Every avoided torpedo, every convoy that reached port safely, was a testament not just to his ideas, but to his unwavering belief that even the smallest voice could influence the vast machinery of war. As the sun climbed higher, casting glimmers across the restless sea, Thomas realized something profound. Courage was not measured by size or age, but by the willingness to act in the face of fear. He had dared, he had calculated, and he had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. And in that triumph, the boy who had once been dismissed as merely a dreamer now stood as a symbol of hope, ingenuity, and the extraordinary power of a single, determined mind. Years later, the story of Thomas Fletcher spread far beyond the quiet cliffs of Lyme Regis. Naval officers recounted the daring strategy of a boy whose maps and calculations had saved convoys from the deadly grasp of German U-boats. His impossible plan had been adopted in modified forms across the Atlantic, influencing convoy routes and early warning tactics long after the first trial. The boy who had once scribbled on candlelit papers had left a mark on history, proving that courage and intellect were not confined to age or experience. Thomas himself grew quietly, never seeking fame, yet always carrying the memory of those nights spent watching the Atlantic, imagining the dangers below. Every ship that sailed safely, every sailor returned home to their families, reminded him that his small acts could ripple outward in ways unimaginable. The officers who had once doubted him now spoke of his insight with admiration, and Professor Whitman often cited Thomas's work as an example of ingenuity unbound by conventional expectations. In town, parents told their children the story of the boy who dared to challenge the impossible, a reminder that even the smallest voice could influence the course of events. For Thomas, it was not accolades or recognition that mattered, it was knowing that one person's determination could make the difference between life and death, between despair and hope. Standing once more on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, now a young man, Thomas breathed in the salty air, watching ships glide safely through the waters he had once studied so obsessively. He reflected on the fear, the doubt, and the relentless drive that had carried him through those long, uncertain nights, and he knew that bravery was not measured by size, nor innovation by years, but by the willingness to act when the stakes were highest. As the waves crashed rhythmically against the cliffs, Thomas Fletcher smiled, understanding a truth that would guide him and generations to come. Sometimes, one mind, one daring plan, and one refusal to surrender to fear could change the world.